The morning Mabel Kingsley pointed a Winchester rifle at Baron Matthew Ashford's chest was the same morning half of Sweetwater Valley decided she had finally lost her mind, and the other half decided she was the bravest woman west of the Continental Divide. It was the spring of 1885, and the grass along Kingsley Creek had just begun to green after a hard winter, the kind that had killed off cattle by the hundreds across the Wyoming Territory and left ranchers scrambling to rebuild their herds before summer. Mabel stood on the low rise above the creek, her boots planted in mud, her dark hair escaping its braid in the wind, and she did not lower that rifle even when Matthew Ashford's black gelding pulled up not 10 feet from her, snorting steam into the cold air. "You are standing on Ashford land," Matthew said, though his voice carried more curiosity than command. "I am standing on Kingsley land," Mabel answered. "Same as I was standing on it yesterday, and same as my father stood on it for 15 years before a fool notion took hold of you that you could fence off the only water for 3 miles and call it progress." Matthew Ashford was 29 years old, tall in the saddle, dressed in a coat too fine for a man who claimed to work his own cattle, though to be fair to him, he did work them, more than most men of his fortune bothered to. He had inherited 40,000 acres from his father, a Boston financier who had come west in the 1860s to build a cattle empire on the open range, and Matthew had spent his whole life being told that a man's worth in this country was measured in acres and head of cattle and nothing else. He looked down at Mabel Kingsley now, at the rifle steady in her hands, and felt something he had not felt in a long while, which was the distinct sensation of being outmatched. "That fence was put up on legal survey lines," he said carefully. "My foreman assures me the creek bend falls within the boundary my father purchased in 1871. Your foreman is a liar, and you know it, or you would not still be sitting on that horse instead of riding home to correct him," Mabel said. "My father filed his claim under the Homestead Act in 1868, 160 acres, proved up and patented, with water rights recorded at the land office in Cheyenne. I have the papers in a tin box under my bed, Mr. Ashford, and I will ride to Cheyenne myself and show them to a federal judge before I let you starve my cattle for want of a drink." For a long moment neither of them spoke. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, and somewhere behind Mabel, in the small clapboard house her father had built board by board, her younger brother Thomas watched from the window, 17 years old and too smart to come out and make things worse. "I did not come to threaten you," Matthew finally said. "Then why did you come, riding onto my land with 4 of your hired men trailing behind you like you expected trouble?" Matthew glanced back at the 4 riders who had stopped a respectful distance away, and for the first time that morning he looked almost embarrassed. "I came to make you an offer, a fair one. My family has wanted the Kingsley parcel for years on account of the water. I am prepared to pay you more than any homestead in this valley has ever fetched, enough to start fresh somewhere with better range, somewhere the winters do not take everything a person has worked for." Mabel lowered the rifle then, not because she trusted him, but because she wanted him to see her face clearly when she answered. "This is not a parcel to me, Mr. Ashford. This is my father's grave, not 50 yards from where you are sitting. This is my mother's rose bush, still blooming by the door 6 years after she passed of the fever. You cannot buy what this land means because you have never once in your life had to earn a single thing you own. It was given to you, or it was taken by men working for your father with rifles not so different from this one. So no, I will not sell, not for any sum you can name." She turned then and walked back toward the house, and Matthew Ashford sat his horse for a long while afterward, watching her go, feeling the strange weight of having been seen clearly by someone for perhaps the first time in his adult life. That night in the great house he had built on the bluff above the valley, a house with glass windows shipped from Denver, and a piano no one in 50 miles knew how to play, Matthew sat before the fire with a glass of whiskey, He did not drink and thought about the way Mabel Kingsley had looked at him, as though he were something to be endured rather than admired. He was not accustomed to it. Women in the territory tended to look at him the way they looked at good grazing land, with calculation and a kind of hunger dressed up as affection. His own father had told him once, before the heart trouble took him 3 winters past, that a man in Matthew's position ought to marry for advantage, the same as he bought cattle or leased range, and Matthew had believed it because it was easier than believing anything else. His land agent, a lean and quiet man named Silas Pratt, found him there by the fire near midnight. "You went out to the Kingsley place," Pratt said. "It was not a question." "I did. And she refused to sell, and she is right about the water rights, Silas. I want you to check the survey again, properly this time." Something flickered behind Pratt's eyes, there and gone so quickly that Matthew, distracted by thoughts of a rifle and a braid coming loose in the wind, did not notice it at all. "Of course, Mr. Ashford," Pratt said, "though I would not put too much stock in what a woman says about legal boundaries. She is proud, that one, and pride makes people say all manner of things that are not strictly true." "She had the patent number recorded from memory," Matthew said. "I do not think pride explains that." Pratt only smiled thinly and excused himself, and Matthew did not think again that night about the particular coldness in his land agent's eyes, though he would come to regret that oversight before the summer was through. The following weeks brought no peace to Kingsley Creek. Twice Mabel found sections of Ashford fence had been moved another few feet onto her side of the property line, small enough that she could not prove it was deliberate, large enough that the water access grew thinner each time. Thomas wanted to ride to town and fetch the sheriff, but Mabel knew Sheriff Collins owed his position to Ashford money as much as any lawman in the territory owed his star to the cattle barons who funded elections, and she did not trust that justice would come from that direction. Instead, on a Sunday when the church bell in Sweetwater Crossing called the valley to worship, Mabel found herself standing in the same room as Matthew Ashford for the second time in a month, though this time there was no rifle between them, only a churchyard full of people, and the smell of Sunday dinners cooking in a dozen nearby homes. "Miss Kingsley," he said, removing his hat, and she noted despite herself that his hands, though soft compared to a working rancher's, were not the hands of a man who had never touched a branding iron. "Mr. Ashford, I owe you an apology," he said, low enough that only she could hear it. "I looked into the survey myself this week, rode the line with my own transit and chain, and you were right. The creek bend belongs to your patent, not mine. I have already ordered the fence moved back." Mabel studied him, searching his face for the trick she was certain must be there, because men like Matthew Ashford did not simply admit fault, not in her experience, not in a territory where fault was something to be litigated and delayed and buried under paperwork until the smaller party gave up from exhaustion. But she found no trick in his eyes, only a kind of uncertain honesty that unsettled her more than his arrogance had. "That is decent of you," she said finally. "Decent is not a word I expected to use about you, Mr. Ashford, so do not let it go to your head." The corner of his mouth lifted, the first real smile she had seen from him. "I will try to bear the disappointment." Around them the churchgoers filed toward the doors, and Thomas appeared at his sister's elbow, giving Matthew a look that was equal parts suspicion and youthful curiosity. "Is he bothering you, Mabel?" "Not this time," she said, and found to her own surprise that she meant it. Spring turned toward summer, and though Matthew Ashford kept his word about the fence, he did not stay away from Kingsley Creek. He found reasons to ride that direction. A strayed calf here, a question about the shared boundary there, until even Thomas stopped pretending to be suspicious of the visits and started saving Matthew a seat at the supper table without being asked. Mabel told herself it meant nothing, that a baron did not spend his afternoons discussing irrigation ditches with a homesteader's daughter unless he wanted something. But as June wore on, she found herself watching for his horse on the ridge road all the same, and hating herself a little for it. It was on one such afternoon, with the creek running high from mountain snowmelt and the meadow grass tall enough to hide a fox, that Matthew finally said the thing he had been circling for weeks. "I have been thinking," he said, as they walked the fence line together, "that there might be a way to solve this dispute between our families once and for all. Is that so?" "A marriage," he said, and Mabel stopped walking. "Between us. It would join the water rights permanently, end any question of boundary, and give your brother a share in one of the largest operations in the territory. I have spoken to my banker in Cheyenne. It is a sound arrangement, Miss Kingsley, for both our houses." For a moment Mabel simply stared at him, and the silence stretched long enough that a meadowlark finished its whole song before she spoke. "A sound arrangement," she repeated. "You make it sound like you are proposing to buy another section of range, Mr. Ashford." "I only meant, I know exactly what you meant." Her voice was quiet now, more dangerous than it had been the day she held a rifle on him. "You have spent your whole life adding things up. Acres and cattle, and now, it seems, a wife, all sums on a ledger to make your holdings whole. Well, hear me now and hear me clearly. You may own 40,000 acres of this territory. You may own the bank in town and half the men who work your range and even, God help them, the sheriff's badge itself. But you will never own me the way you own this land. I am not a boundary line to be settled, Mr. Ashford. I am not a fence to be moved to your convenience. If a man ever marries me, it will be because he loves me enough to let me be free, not because he wants to add my acres to his." She turned and walked away from him then, back toward the house, and Matthew Ashford stood alone in the tall grass with her words ringing in his ears like a struck bell, and for the first time in his life he did not know what to say at all. He did not sleep well that night, nor for several nights after. He found himself remembering, unbidden, the way his father had spoken of Matthew's mother, dead now 12 years, a woman Matthew barely recalled except as a portrait above the mantel, and a name mentioned mostly in the context of the dowry she had brought to the marriage. He had never once heard his father say he loved her. He had heard him say, many times, that she had been a good investment for the family. Was that what Matthew had offered Mabel Kingsley? An investment? He turned the thought over and did not like the shape of it. It was Silas Pratt who interrupted this reckoning, arriving at the ranch house one humid evening in July with news that should have been simple and was not. "There is trouble at the Kingsley place," Pratt said. "Someone cut their fence last night and near 40 head of their cattle wandered onto the Delacroix range to the south. Old man Delacroix is already threatening to hold them as strays under territorial law unless the Kingsleys pay a recovery fee they cannot afford." Matthew was on his feet before Pratt finished speaking. "Cut the fence? Whose fence?" "Theirs, from what I hear. Deliberate by the look of the wire." "And you are certain none of our hands were involved?" Pratt's expression did not so much as flicker. "Of course not, Mr. Ashford. Why would you even ask such a thing?" But Matthew had learned, in the weeks of walking fence lines with Mabel Kingsley, to notice the small tells of a man's honesty, and something in Pratt's too quick answer left a residue of doubt that would not wash away. He said nothing of it then, only ordered his horse saddled, and rode through the gathering dark toward Kingsley Creek with a growing dread in his chest that had nothing to do with cattle or fences, and everything to do with a woman who had told him, in no uncertain terms, that he would never own her. He found Mabel in the yard with a lantern, Thomas beside her with a rifle across his knees, both of them exhausted and furious and trying to work out how they would ever afford old man Delacroix's recovery fee on top of a summer's worth of feed and the property taxes due in the fall. "Ashford," Mabel said, not bothering to hide her weariness, "if you have come to gloat, you have chosen a poor night for it." "I have not come to gloat. I have come to help if you will let me." "Help." She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Forgive me if I do not trust the timing, Mr. Ashford. My fence was cut the very week I refused to marry you." The accusation landed like a blow, and Matthew felt his stomach drop because he could not in that moment swear to her that it was untrue. "I did not order this," he said. "I swear it on my father's grave, Mabel, I did not." It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the way he said it, raw and pleading, made her look at him more closely. "Then who did?" "I do not know, but I intend to find out." He dismounted and walked closer. close enough that Thomas raised the rifle slightly before Mabel put a hand on his arm to still him. "I will pay Delacroix's fee myself tonight, and I will send my men to help drive your cattle back before sunrise, and I will find whoever cut that fence if it takes me the rest of the summer. And if it turns out to be one of your own men," Matthew's jaw tightened, "then I will deal with him myself, and you will have my word on it in writing if that is what it takes for you to believe me." Mabel studied him a long moment in the lantern light, and something in his face, the genuine fear beneath the determination, convinced her more than any promise could have. "All right," she said quietly. "Help us find the cattle. We will speak of trust another time." They rode through the night together, Matthew's 4 hands joining Thomas and Mabel in the difficult work of gathering scattered cattle from Delacroix Range in the dark. And by the gray hour before dawn the herd was mostly recovered, though 3 head remained missing and would turn up dead a week later, run off a ravine in the confusion. Matthew paid Delacroix's fee without argument, though the old rancher grumbled about barons who could not keep their neighbors' fences intact, an insult Matthew swallowed without response because he was too tired and too troubled to defend himself. It was Mabel who found him afterward, sitting on an overturned water trough near her barn as the sun came up pink and gold over the ridge, his fine coat streaked with mud, his hands raw from rope work he was not accustomed to. "You did not have to do all that," she said, handing him a tin cup of coffee she had made on the stove inside. "I wanted to." He took the coffee gratefully. "Mabel, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. That depends on the question. Do you believe I had any part in this?" She sat down on the trough beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said finally, "I do not believe you did, but I believe someone close to you did, and I believe you had better find out who before it happens again." Matthew nodded slowly. "I intend to." They sat together in silence as the sun climbed, and for the first time since his father's death, Matthew Ashford felt something like peace, sitting on a water trough beside a woman covered in dust and exhaustion, a woman who owed him nothing and had made that abundantly clear, and yet had allowed him to sit beside her all the same. The investigation Matthew launched into his own operation moved slowly, hampered by the fact that Silas Pratt had been managing the Ashford holdings for nearly a decade, and knew every trick a man could use to hide his tracks in a ledger book or a bill of sale. But Matthew was patient, and more importantly, he had begun to ride to Kingsley Creek nearly every day, ostensibly to help repair the damaged fence, though both he and Mabel knew by now that the fence had long since been mended, and the visits continued for reasons neither of them spoke aloud. It was during one such visit, in the golden hush of late July, that Mabel finally let down some portion of the guard she had kept raised against him since the day of the rifle. "My father used to say this creek sounded like a woman laughing," she told him, as they sat on the bank watching the water run clear over smooth stones. He said it was the reason he chose this claim over 3 others he had scouted that spring. Not the grass, not the soil, the sound of the water. "He sounds like he was a thoughtful man." "He was stubborn," Mabel said, smiling despite herself. "Stubborn as a Missouri mule, my mother used to say. He came out from Ohio in 1867 with nothing but a wagon and a rifle and the clothes on his back, and he built this whole place with his own 2 hands, board by board, fence post by fence post. When he died," she stopped, and Matthew waited without pushing her. "When he died, I was 19. Thomas was only 14. Everyone in the valley expected us to sell out within the year. A woman and a boy, they said, could not hold a homestead against hard winters and worse men. I have spent 5 years proving them wrong, Mr. Ashford, and I do not intend to stop now, no matter how many fences your foreman moves or how many offers you make me." "I believe you," Matthew said, and he found to his own surprise that he meant it entirely. "I think you are the strongest person I have ever known, Mabel Kingsley, and I am ashamed of the way I first approached you. I saw a boundary line where I should have seen a woman who had earned every inch of what she holds." Mabel turned to look at him then, searching his face in the fading light. "Why does that matter to you? A month ago you offered to marry me the same way you would buy a parcel of range. What has changed?" Matthew was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words with a care he had not exercised in years. "I have spent my whole life believing that a man's worth was measured by what he could acquire," he said finally. "My father taught me that lesson before I could walk, and I never once questioned it, because questioning it would have meant questioning him, and I loved him too much for that, even when he was wrong. But you have made me question it, Mabel. Every day I ride out here, I find myself wanting something I cannot buy and cannot fence and cannot add to a ledger. I want you to look at me the way you look at this creek, like something that belongs to no one but itself, and yet is beautiful enough to be worth loving anyway." For a moment neither of them spoke, the only sound the laughing water and a meadowlark somewhere in the tall grass, and then Mabel reached out and took his hand, careful and slow, as though testing whether the gesture would hold. "That is the first true thing you have ever said to me, Matthew Ashford," she said softly. It was the first time she had used his given name, and he felt it land somewhere deep in his chest, warmer than any sum of acres had ever made him feel. But peace in Sweetwater Valley, like peace anywhere in the territory in those hard years of range wars and water disputes, was not destined to last. 2 weeks later, Matthew finally uncovered the proof he had been searching for. A ledger, hidden in a locked drawer of Silas Pratt's office, detailing payments made to 3 drifters who had passed through the valley in June, the same 3 men who had since disappeared south toward Colorado. The payments were listed under false pretenses, disguised as wages for fence repair, but the dates matched precisely with the night the Kingsley fence had been cut. Matthew confronted Pratt that same evening, the ledger open between them on the desk in the great house. "Explain this," Matthew said, his voice cold in a way Pratt had never heard from him before. Pratt's composure cracked only slightly. "I did it for the ranch, Mr. Ashford, for your father's legacy. That water is worth more to this operation than any sentiment you have developed for the Kingsley girl. I thought if she was pressured enough, she would sell, and the whole valley's water would finally belong to Ashford land, the way your father always intended. My father is dead, Silas, and I am the one who decides what this land intends now. You put my name, my family's name, on an act of theft and sabotage against a woman and her brother who have done nothing but work honestly for what is theirs. You are finished here. I want you off Ashford land by morning, and if I hear of you troubling the Kingsleys again, I will see you brought before a federal judge in Cheyenne myself." Pratt's face darkened with fury, but he saw in Matthew's eyes that there would be no negotiating this, and he left that night, riding south with whatever he could pack into a single saddlebag, and the valley would not see him again for many months, though his final act of spite was still to come. Matthew rode to Kingsley Creek the next morning to tell Mabel everything, the ledger in his saddlebag as proof, expecting relief, perhaps even gratitude. What he found instead was a scene of fresh disaster, smoke rising from the eastern pasture, where a fire, deliberately set in the night by men Pratt had hired before his dismissal, men who had not yet heard he was cast out and had carried through his final orders regardless, had swept through a section of dry summer grass dangerously close to the barn. Mabel and Thomas were already fighting the blaze with wet sacks and shovels when Matthew arrived, and he threw himself from his horse without hesitation, tearing off his fine coat to beat at the flames alongside them. The fire was fierce but not yet unmanageable, fed by grass rather than timber, and with 3 of them working desperately in the smoke and heat, they managed to cut a break wide enough to stop its advance before it reached the barn, though not before it consumed nearly 10 acres of grazing land that Mabel had counted on for winter feed. They collapsed together in the ash-blackened field afterward, coughing, exhausted, faces streaked with soot, and it was there, in that moment of shared devastation and survival, that Matthew finally understood the full weight of what he had allowed to happen under his name. "This is my fault," he said, his voice hoarse from smoke. "Pratt did this before he left, I am certain of it. Men he hired and paid before I threw him off my land. I should have caught this sooner. I should have questioned him the day the first fence was moved, instead of trusting him because it was convenient to trust him." Mabel looked at him, her face grimy and exhausted, and something in his genuine anguish moved her more than any grand gesture could have. "You did not set this fire, Matthew. You rode here the moment you learned the truth, and you fought it beside us with your own hands. That is not the action of a guilty man. That is the action of a man trying to make things right." "It is not enough," he said. "I have spent months treating your land, your water, your very self, as things to be acquired, and even after I knew better, my own household still brought fire to your doorstep. I do not know how I could ever make that right." Mabel reached out and took his soot-blackened hand in hers, the same gesture she had offered him weeks before beside the creek, though now it carried the weight of everything they had endured together. "You already have begun," she said. "You brought the ledger. You threw Pratt off your land. You fought this fire beside my brother and me instead of watching from a distance the way a baron might. That is not nothing, Matthew. That is everything." Thomas, sitting nearby with his own hands blistered from shovel work, spoke up then, his young voice rough with smoke but steady with conviction. "My father used to say a man is measured by what he does when no one is forcing him to do it. You did not have to ride out here with proof against your own foreman. You did not have to burn your hands helping us save the barn. I reckon that says something about the kind of man you are, Mr. Ashford, whether or not you were born a baron's son." Matthew looked between brother and sister, and something in his chest loosened that had been tight for as long as he could remember, a knot of expectation and inheritance, and the terrible loneliness of believing that love was simply another transaction to be negotiated. "Thank you," he said quietly, and he meant it more than he had meant anything in years. They rebuilt in the weeks that followed, and the valley itself seemed to shift in response to the change taking root at Kingsley Creek. Matthew sent his own hands, this time chosen with far greater care, to help repair the burned fence line and replant what grass could still be saved before the first frost. He hired a new foreman, a steady older man named Everett Hale who had worked cattle for 20 years and had no patience for scheming. And under Hale's management, the Ashford operation began to run with an honesty it had lacked for years. But it was the water rights that Matthew knew in his heart he had to settle once and for all, not as a negotiation or an offer of marriage disguised as commerce, but as an act of simple justice. He rode to Kingsley Creek on a bright September morning, the aspens on the ridge above just beginning to turn gold, and found Mabel in the yard hanging wash on a line strung between two fence posts. He dismounted and stood before her with a folded document in his hand, and something in his expression made her set down the wet shirt she had been pinning and give him her full attention. "What is this?" she asked, as he held the paper out to her. "A deed," Matthew said. "Recorded yesterday at the land office in Cheyenne, in your name and your brother's name both, granting full and permanent water rights to the entire length of the creek that runs through your property, with no claim reserved to Ashford land whatsoever. I also included a clause releasing any easement my father's original survey might have claimed along the northern boundary. This creek is yours, Mabel, entirely yours. Not shared, not disputed, not something I hold any leverage over ever again." Mabel unfolded the document with trembling hands and read it through twice, her eyes growing bright with unshed tears by the time she finished. "Matthew, this is worth a fortune. Why would you simply give it away?" "Because it was never truly mine to hold over you in the first place," he said. "You told me once that I would never own you the way I own this land, and you were right to say it, because I did not understand the difference then between owning something and loving it. I thought if I could not possess a thing outright, I had no right to want it at all. But I have learned these past months that the things worth having in this life cannot be fenced or deeded or bought at any price. They can only be given freely and received the same way. I do not want to own your water, Mabel Kingsley. I do not want to own you. I only want to love you if you will let me, exactly as free as you have always insisted on being. Mabel set the deed carefully on the porch rail, weighted down with a stone against the wind, and stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the tears now spilling freely down her sun-browned cheeks. "That is the truest thing you have ever said to me," she whispered. "Then may I say one more true thing?" "You may." "I love you, Mabel Kingsley. Not your creek, not your land, not the boundary lines that first brought us together. I love your stubbornness and your honesty and the way you looked at me over the barrel of a rifle without an ounce of fear. I love the sound of your laugh, which I have worked very hard these past months to earn, and I love the way you have taught me, more than any lesson my father ever gave me, what it means to want someone's happiness more than I want their surrender. I am not asking you to marry me to settle a boundary dispute. I am asking you because I cannot imagine a single morning of the rest of my life that would be worth living without you in it." Mabel laughed then, through her tears, a bright and unguarded sound that Matthew would treasure for the rest of his days. "Are you asking me, Matthew Ashford, or are you simply hoping I will finish the sentence for you?" "I am asking," he said, and dropped to one knee in the dusty yard, heedless of his fine trousers, and produced a small ring, simple gold with no stone, purchased not from a Cheyenne jeweler but forged by the blacksmith in Sweetwater Crossing at Matthew's own request, because he had wanted it to be something made by honest hands rather than bought with idle money. "Mabel Kingsley, will you marry me? Not as a merger of land, not as a settlement of any dispute, but as two free people who have chosen each other with open eyes and open hearts." Mabel looked down at him, at this man who had once tried to buy her silence with an offer that treated her like a parcel of range, now kneeling in the dirt of her father's homestead with tears in his own eyes and a ring made by a blacksmith's honest hammer, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since the day her father died and left her to prove the whole valley wrong about what a woman alone could hold. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Matthew Ashford, I will marry you." He rose and swept her into his arms, and the wet laundry forgotten on the line snapped in the September wind, and somewhere in the house Thomas whooped loud enough to startle the horses, having apparently been watching the whole exchange from the window with considerably less discretion than he believed himself to possess. They were married in October, on a day when the cottonwoods along Kingsley Creek had turned the color of old gold, and the whole valley, it seemed, turned out for the occasion. The ceremony was held not at Matthew's grand house on the bluff, as convention might have suggested, but in the yard of the Kingsley homestead itself, beneath a canopy Thomas and Everett Hale had built from raw timber and canvas, with the creek singing its water laughter in the background, just as it had the day Mabel's father first chose this claim over 3 others. The town preacher, a kindly and elderly man named Reverend Whitfield, who had baptized half the valley and buried the other half, spoke words that made more than one hardened rancher reach for a handkerchief. Old man Delacroix, who had once threatened to hold the Kingsley cattle as strays, sat in the front row beside his wife, having long since forgiven the debt in light of everything that followed, and even Sheriff Collins attended, perhaps sensing that the political winds in the valley had shifted permanently toward honesty now that Silas Pratt's schemes had been exposed, and his name was no longer welcome anywhere between Cheyenne and the Wind River country. Mabel wore her mother's wedding dress, taken in slightly at the waist and let out at the shoulders by the seamstress in town, and when she walked toward Matthew beneath that canvas canopy, her brother Thomas at her side in place of the father who could not be there, Matthew felt his throat tighten with an emotion he had no ledger entry for, no acreage to compare it to, nothing in his whole life of counting and acquiring that had prepared him for the simple, overwhelming fact of loving someone so completely. "Do you, Matthew Ashford, take this woman?" Reverend Whitfield began, and Matthew answered before the question was even fully asked, drawing a ripple of warm laughter from the gathered crowd, and Mabel's eyes shone with tears and mirth both as she squeezed his hands. "Do you, Mabel Kingsley, take this man?" the Reverend continued, and Mabel ever herself took a moment longer, long enough to look Matthew directly in the eye and say, loud enough for the whole yard to hear, "I take him, Reverend, not because he owns half this valley, but because he finally learned what it means not to. I do." The valley erupted in applause and laughter, and Matthew kissed his bride beneath the gold cottonwoods while the creek ran on beside them, indifferent to deeds and surveys and boundary lines, singing the same laughing song it had sung for Mabel's father 17 years before. They built their life together in the years that followed, not by merging two operations into one baron's holding, as Matthew might once have imagined, but by keeping the Kingsley homestead as Mabel's own, worked jointly with Thomas as he grew into a fine young rancher in his own right, while Matthew's larger operation on the bluff ran alongside it. The two enterprises connected not by ownership but by partnership, by shared water freely given and shared labor freely offered. Matthew learned to mend fence with his own hands rather than simply ordering it done, and Mabel learned, slowly and not without some resistance, to accept help when it was offered without strings, a lesson nearly as hard for her as letting go of ownership had been for him. In the spring of 1887, a little less than 2 years after the day Mabel had first held a rifle on him beside the creek, their first child was born, a son they named William after Mabel's father, a boy with his mother's stubborn chin and his father's quiet thoughtfulness, who grew up running barefoot along the creek bank and knowing every bend of the water his grandfather had chosen a homestead for. 2 years after that came a daughter, Grace, named for no one in particular except the Grace both her parents agreed had been required to bring them together across the divide of pride and inheritance that had once stood between them. A third child followed in 1891, another son they called Everett after the honest foreman who had helped rebuild what Pratt's fire destroyed. And by then the Ashford and Kingsley lands together supported one of the most respected operations in the newly minted state of Wyoming, admitted to the Union that same year. Its water shared freely along every mile of Kingsley Creek, exactly as the deed Matthew had signed all those years before promised it would be. Silas Pratt was never seen in Sweetwater Valley again, though word reached them once, some years later, that he had been arrested in Colorado for a similar scheme of land fraud, and had served 2 years in the territorial prison before disappearing from record entirely. Matthew felt no satisfaction in the news beyond a quiet relief that the man's capacity for harm had finally been checked by someone other than himself. Old Man Delacroix became, in time, one of Matthew and Mabel's closest neighbors and friends, and it was his grandson who would, many years later, court and eventually marry young Grace Ashford, joining two families whose fathers had once quarreled over strayed cattle in a manner that Mabel found endlessly amusing whenever she thought back on it. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Matthew took Mabel back to the same rise above the creek where she had once held a rifle on him, the same spot where the water still ran clear over smooth stones, and sang its laughing song beneath the cottonwoods, now grown taller and broader with the passing years. Their children ran ahead of them toward the water, William at 10 years old already showing his grandfather's stubborn love of the land, Grace close behind him, with her mother's bright, unafraid laugh, and little Everett toddling determinedly in their wake under the watchful eye of his Uncle Thomas, now a grown man of 28 with a homestead and family of his own just up the valley. "Do you remember," Mabel said, taking her husband's hand as they walked, "the exact words I said to you that first spring right here on this very ground?" "I remember every word," Matthew said. "You told me I would never own you the way I own this land. And do you understand it now, truly?" Matthew looked out over the creek, at his children playing in the shallows, at the fence lines that no longer divided but connected two families' fortunes, at the valley spread golden and green in every direction beneath a sky so wide it seemed to hold the whole of the Wyoming Territory within it, and finally at his wife, standing beside him with the same fierce, unbought spirit that had first stopped him cold on this very rise 10 years before. "I understand it," he said, "because I finally learned the difference between holding something and being trusted with it. I can fence this land, plow it, deed it, pass it down to our children when I am gone. But you, Mabel Kingsley Ashford, you were never mine to hold in that way, and I thank God every single day that you refused to let me try. You gave yourself to me freely, and that is worth more than every acre I was ever born owning. I do not own you, my love. I never will. I only get to love you for as long as you will have me, and I consider that the finest bargain I have ever struck in my entire life." Mabel smiled, the same smile that had undone him completely on a September morning in the dusty yard of her father's homestead, and rose on her toes to kiss him there on the ridge above the singing water, while their children laughed and splashed below, heirs not to a baron's cold empire of acreage and ledgers, but to something far rarer in that wide, hard, beautiful territory, a love that had been freely given and freely returned, and had asked nothing of ownership at all. They walked down together to join their children at the water's edge, and the creek ran on beneath the cottonwoods exactly as it always had, indifferent to deeds and boundaries, carrying its laughing song out across the valley that Mabel Kingsley Ashford and Matthew Ashford had built together, not as baron and subject, not as buyer and land, but as two equal hearts who had found, against every expectation the territory had set for them, a partnership as enduring and as free as the water itself.